What the psychoanalysts offered us that no other school of psychology has managed so far is the notion that human beings are basically a loose collection of spirits instead of entities that are transparent to themselves and primarily rational. For the psychoanalyst, you're like a room full of ghosts, and you, the you that you think you are, might be one ghost among all those ghosts, and it even might think that it's the ghost in charge, but the probability that the part about being in charge is true is zero. It's simply not the case. And one of the other things that the psychoanalysts have to offer, which neither the cognitive scientists nor even the emotional neuroscientists have realized, is that the structures through which we look at the world and also the structures that motivate us are actually alive. We don't have mechanical cognitions. What we have is, what we are is a sequence of embodiment by different motivated spirits. And you know that perfectly well if you watch yourself behave over a 2-week period. You're a different person when you're angry, you're a different person when you're afraid, you're a different person when you argue with someone you love, you're a different person when you're confused. You know, you're a different person when you're egotistical, you're a different person when you're wrong. And it takes a tremendous amount of psychological development before there's any coherence across those multiple selves, except the coherence of memory and post hoc rationalization. Now, one of the most terrifying realizations that the psychoanalysts lead people to is the realization that they are not alone in their heads. Now, you can debate whether or not the space that you inhabit is in your head, because I don't really think that's accurate, but I don't think you can debate the proposition that you are not alone in your being. And it's also very difficult to debate the proposition that you're not the captain of the ship, or if you are, there's plenty of skeletons below decks. Now, Freud, for his part, even though he was a 19th century rationalist, at least in terms of his formal thinking, was also someone who was painfully aware of the role of fundamental irrationality, romantic irrationality in people's lives. And Freud basically concentrated on the two elements of existence that were particularly anathema to the Victorians, and one of those was sexuality, and the other was aggression. Now, sexuality was problematic for the Victorians, not merely because they were repressive, but because sexuality is a terrible demon, so to speak. I mean, a large part of the movie that you just watched is an expression of the idea that sexuality is a terrible demon, and also that it's closely allied with aggression. I mean, the blonde woman is basically possessed, and she's possessed to the point where she becomes not only murderous but suicidal. And Freud attempted with all his might to point out to the Victorians, especially the aristocratic Victorians, who thought of themselves as rational masters, that they were embodied creatures with an animal nature, and that they were motivated in large part by forces that not only did they not understand, but they didn't even want to admit existed. Now, the blonde woman in the initial parts of the movie, when she's seen off by her uncle and aunt, is basically Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz. You know, she's raised somewhere by loving relatives, and the aunt and the uncle, or the older couple, play that role. They wish her well in her wonderful adventure into Hollywood, and she naively accepts their benevolence as, you know, an appropriate way of interacting with her. And of course, it's not appropriate at all. She's naive right to the bloody core. Whoever really were her parents did an absolutely dismal job of preparing her for reality. They allowed her to nurture naive princess-like fantasies that are so fractured and sketchy that they have zero adaptive utility, and they basically set her up for catastrophic failure. And from the Freudian perspective, that's an Oedipal story, because the fundamental lesson of Freud's Oedipal theory is, do not let your theoretically benevolent caretakers delude you into naive faith. So in the Freudian scheme of things, the Oedipal mother, for example, infantilizes her son. Now, Freud read that as a familial pathology, and Jung read that as a mythological pathology, even though Freud did talk about Oedipus as a myth. And Freud's basic idea with regards to the Oedipal complex was that it's very easy for a mother to entice her son, but even more broadly, for parents to entice their children into a false sense of dependent security by helping them pretend that the world is much more benevolent and simple than it really is. Now, Freud's observation of that was that the reason that the parents did that was twofold. One was that they were cowardly and unable to look at the world as it really was, and second, that their fundamental aim was to eradicate the independent strivings of their children so that they would never leave home, so that the parents didn't have to suffer from loneliness. So it's an ugly, ugly, ugly story, and this is partly why Freud is being met with so much resistance. There's lots of reasons, but he's absolutely right. I mean, Freud's basic Oedipal theory was that the most difficult thing that a human being has to do is to develop enough independence to break away from the maternal nest or the familial nest so that they can live an independent existence, and that there's multiple ways that that can be seriously interfered with, some of which border on incestuous. And I mean, I appreciated that when I first read Freud, but once I became a clinical psychologist, I thought, well, yeah, that's just exactly how it is. I never have anybody in my therapy practice whose parents made them too independent. That never happens. Never. I have any number of people in my clinical practice whose parents seriously interfered with their children striving towards independence. So, and Freud believed that was universal. He believed that the reason the Oedipal myth was universal was because it was very difficult for creatures who had as long a history of dependence as human beings and who were born so helpless to develop an independent identity given the need for their protection across, an 18-year period. So Jung viewed that in a slightly more profound manner in some ways, because he thought of it as a problem that transcended the mere family, because Jung believed that one of the temptations of consciousness itself was to hide from reality, and that you didn't necessarily need any parental interference with your development to hide your head in the sand from the true nature of reality, like someone who was naive. So he believed that that was also an existential problem, and he believed that partly because he was a student of Nietzsche, who observed quite rightly that much of what passes for morality is in fact cowardice. And of course this movie picks up on that theme to some tremendous degree, because although Betty is very naive, part of that naivety is merely cowardice. She just doesn't have any life experience at all. And you see very rapidly in the movie that when she's actually presented with temptation, her facade of naive morality is eradicated instantly the second she's given any temptation. So she falls prey to the love affair. She hesitates not at all to break and enter. She ends up hiring a murderer. I mean, she's not a good girl, Betty, Betty like the Betty in the Archie comics. She's not a good girl at all. She's just someone who's so inexperienced and clueless that she lives in an Oedipal dream world. And she thinks of Hollywood as a magical fantasy place where dreams come true, like they do for Cinderella. And you see the Cinderella motif the first time she encounters the director and does her scene when she's singing like some princess, and then she has to run out at the last moment. There's a bit of a brief utilization of the myth of Cinderella in there, just like there is utilization of the idea of the Wizard of Oz. I mean, Betty is basically Dorothy, and you see the great and wonderful Oz manipulating things behind the scenes. So the psychoanalytic perspective is that people are inhabited by multiple spirits, and they are not clearly the masters in their own houses. And as far as I'm concerned, to not believe that is mere naivety. it seems to me, especially as a consequence of thinking of it for so long, that it's self-evidently true, and that if people merely meditate on that in their own life for any period of time, they can understand that very rapidly.